Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. Today we're playing the Neoterran Capitaline Army against Spiral Corps. Wait, what? The what? The what army? That's right, Corvus Belli have added or have indicated that they will be re-adding a number of the sectorals that were removed from the game in the N4 to N5 transition, and that includes Neoterra and Spiral Corps, as well as a few others like French Merovingia, Caledonia, Acontecimento, and Verona. Now, I've actually got some opinions about this kind of from a design and business perspective. We will leave those to the end. But with the promise of the re-release of these sectorals, my friend Ed and I thought we would sit down and see what we could do to approximate what they might look like as they are reintroduced to N5. Now, we've got no special information here. We've chosen Neoterra and Spiral Core because, well, Ed was always going to pick Spiral Core, and I was always going to pick Neoterra because it has a Garuda in it. But also, both are fairly approximatable using existing models Panoceania and Toha. And so, with the caveat that this is a very experimental and not particularly serious game, today we're playing the Neoterran Capitaline Army, or thereabouts, against Spiral Core, or thereabouts, and the scenario is Supremacy. Now, unsurprisingly, I have built my Neoterra, heavy use of quotes, out of generic Panoceania. There are a few assumptions that I am making in terms of putting this army together. The first is that the fire team compositions from Neoterra at the end of N4 will basically translate to N5, and the second is that Auxilia will exist at all. I'm assuming that they are costing the same as they did in N4, not really a huge reason for them to change, which means in this list I have two baseline Auxilia that I'm assuming are costed and statted the same as they were in N4, which means half an SWC for the Lieutenant, 14 points per model. Now, perhaps what shouldn't have surprised me is how much this list just looks like a generic Panoceania list, because with the introduction of some small fire teams to generic Panoceania, you can kind of do a pretty good approximation of Neoterra. There is a fire team that we have here, and it's those first three models that you can't replicate with Panoceania. But otherwise, you could almost build something like this in vPano. So what we have is a Haris team of 2 Orcs and Fusilier by Pandra. Now, you can build a Haris team of Orcs. You can have 2 of them, plus something like Patsy Garnett, for example, as a specialist. But Bipandra is a much more efficient profile. She's cool. I wanted to use her. And so what we have is we have 2 gunfighting orcs. We have a HMG and then a boarding shotgun +1 burst tin bot with a firewall. Firewall is generally useful, but I did know that I would be playing against Spiral Core. And while I haven't hugely tailored this list for Spiral Core, if I had, you would absolutely be seeing an Aquila Guard, because that thing is just a Helot Killer 9000 with the changes to MSV3 in N5, but we have 2 Orcs and Bipandra, Tactical Awareness Bipandra. That's a Willpower 13 Specialist, a Tactical Awareness team. The team has a Tin Bot, which in this scenario against this opponent will be good against Ferroware, and it has a Ballistic Skill 14, Burst 3 +1 Special Die Boarding Shotgun, and I love those. In fact, a little bit of a theme of this list is how many plus burst shotguns can I add, because we're going to follow that up immediately with a Bulletier Heavy Shotgun +1 burst for 19 points and a Blade FTO Engineer. I was kind of a little bit uncertain about this. This doesn't get fire team bonuses. It's basically just a specialist with tactical engineering, tactical awareness and engineering stapled to a serviceable assault remote. And these were actually the last 2 models added to my list after I went and put a bunch of other remotes in the list, including 2 Peacemakers. Once I had 2 Peacemakers, I decided, you know what, I'd like to be able to get an engineer into the midfield to repair these things occasionally, so that Blade and Bulletier got added. They would do just fine. We have 1 Fugazi, because I forgot the AVA of Fugazi in Neoterra. There's 1 more in the second combat group, but I'm pretty sure Neoterra could take 2 of those, maybe even 3. And then 2 Auxiliars, one of whom is the Lieutenant. We then have the first of 2 Peacemakers. This is the Ballistic Skill Attack +1 Burst Peacemaker, which I've wanted to try out for a little while. I like +1 Burst boarding shotguns, and the Peacemaker has Mimetism, Ballistic Skill 12, a Pulsar, which also benefits from +1 Burst, and of course it has the Oxbot. And so this is present as a little bit of an experimental piece. We then have a Garuda Tactbot. Now, in the first version of this list, and the second version of this list, and the third version of this list, as I was trying to make things fit, I actually had a sneaky plan. I am on record as loving Garudas. I think they're probably my favorite profile of N5. And so I knew Ed would expect one. In that vein, I thought, let's just not take one. Let's take a Swiss Guard instead. It'll use 1.5 SWC, and it will be a huge surprise when it reveals. I am so sneaky and clever. Swiss Guard are quite expensive. I could never quite seem to make anything fit, and because I was building this all in Panoceania, I had forgotten what Garudas cost. And in my head, I'm like, well, like, 32 points, right? That's how much you pay for a drop troop Spitfire. No, a Garuda is 25. A Spitfire Garuda is 25 points. So we will slam that thing back into the list, and I do not regret it. In Combat Group 2, we have a second Peacemaker. This one is a Mine Layer. Now, notwithstanding that it says 4 SWC up there, it's not counting the Garuda, it's not counting the Auxilia's Lieutenant, half an SWC. This is a 6 SWC list, assuming the Auxilia cost half an SWC. So we only have the points to make one of the Peacemakers a Mine Layer. Totally fine with that. I wanted to experiment with +1 burst 1 anyway, but we do have a second Peacemaker here. I really like this as a Group 2 unit. Now, 24 points is expensive. It's not cheap. Peacemakers are more expensive than they were at their cheapest in N4. Loved them when they were 20 points back in the day. They aren't anymore. They're 24 points these days. But with Mimetism and a Mine Layer profile, there's some cool stuff going on, and they're the kind of profile I think is interesting and cool as a Group 2 unit. Because any of the Peacemakers profiles, the Oxbots have shock mines. You have a model that can run around laying mines if you have spare orders. And because it's forward deployed and fast, it can move up and attack aggressively as well. Now, kind of in comparison, we'll see the next two models in this fire team, in this group rather, are a Bolt Sniper and a Bolt Hacker. Now, they're great pieces, but something I would run into over the course of the game is that I wanted to move forward and press buttons. There was just never enough orders. There was never enough orders, but the Peacemaker in the same group was able to get mobile and spend just the 4 or 5 orders that the group had much more effectively. Were the bolts bad? No, absolutely not. They're bolts. The sniper was a great gunfighting piece, but it kind of had to stay where it was and just take shots from that position because you can't move pieces like that around too fast. We've then got second Fugazi and just a war correspondent. This list is not trying to do too much in terms of hard ARO pieces. It's mostly building a crumple zone out of things like the 4 Oxbots in the list, for example. But the War Core is just nice to have, something that can just be on ARO, 360 line of sight, and which can like take a flash pulse, or more likely declare a discover roll as things are running toward me, so that when things like under camouflage markers, etc., might hit the Oxbot lines, the Oxbots can actually declare flamethrower attacks. So overall, kind of a bunch of semi-experimental stuff in here, but mostly what we have is a generic Pan-Oceania list that is restricting itself a little bit, doing some things you can't do with generic Pan-Oceania with the fire teams, getting my beloved Auxilia back in the list, and then of course including the best vehicle in the game, the Garuda Tactbot. Now, playing against my totally Neoterra would be Ed's totally Spiral Core. The assumptions that he has made is that you can have Helot Militiamen in Spiral Core. Pretty reasonable. He has also assumed that the Kriegel with smoke grenade launchers rather than regular grenade launchers will make a reappearance. Those were unique to Spiral Core in N4. And he's made some assumptions about link teams and SWC costs. In N4, Spiral Core had just a few SWC discounts. For example, the Greif didn't cost 1 SWC, it cost a half. And given that Onyx Contact Force has a half SWC Greif, it's probably pretty reasonable that we might see something like a half SWC Greif in Spiral Core. Ed is just banking that somewhere in here there's half an SWC discount. Pretty reasonable. The other thing is that apart from those Kriegel having smoke grenade launchers, we are assuming, we're making some assumptions about spiral fire teams, specifically that they are broadly comparable with Toha. Now, in N4, Spiral Core had unlimited fire team duos. That's not necessarily something that will persist in, I mean, it might because a lot of sectoral armies have that, but duo fire teams are more powerful in N4, and this is still a Toha faction, and Toha in N5 have got 2 duos and then unlimited Haris teams. The assumption that we're actually making here is just that these Spiral Core specific troops, Dral and Kriegel, count as the same troop type in some capacity in a Spiral Core link. And that's a particular distinction from generic Toha. These models don't necessarily link that well in generic Toha. Dral in particular lack the triad tag, which means that in generic Toha, you can't have a Dral and one other dude get fire team duo bonuses. In Spiral Core, seems reasonable that that might be a thing. Hope it is, because, spoiler alert, Dral and Kriegel fire teams are really cool. So what have we got going on here? From top to bottom, Ed is doing the thing that he likes to do, where the smaller team is Group 1. It is heretical, but whatever. We've got 2 Helots. One is a light rocket launcher, one is a shock marksman rifle. Both are the camouflage profiles. We just haven't made any assumptions about like Helot linkability. That is a thing in N5, but no idea how Spiral Core would get it. So just assuming that these are the camouflage profiles. We've then got a Diplo Delegate, a Cowrie Sentinel Mine Layer, and a Greif Operator. The basic idea here is that the Greif Operator has just enough orders for a suicide attack run, and otherwise this is just a group that spends very few orders repositioning these irregular pieces, maybe laying mines with the Cowrie, maybe pressing a button or moving forward with the Delegate. But the 2 Helots and the Delegate in particular are units that are quite good at spending just their irregular order every turn to move into progressively more annoying places. Over the course of the game, you could flick the cavalry into Group 1, if Group 2 if there are casualties. Otherwise, this group is meant to just be a dump for the irregular pieces, but one of the things Spiral Corps has always been able to do is take irregular pieces that are kind of self-sufficient. That's pretty cool. Now, in Group 2, we've got two duos of a Drow Mine Layer with AP Marksman Rifle and a Kriegel Agent. Now, as mentioned, we are assuming that the old Spiral Core profiles exist in some capacity, which means that these are actually Smoke Grenade Launcher Kriegels, and one of them is the Lieutenant. The Lieutenant profile always had a discount on SWC in Spiral Core. These are really cool duos. Now, the Drow by itself is very, very close to a fire team in a can. It's an almost good enough gunfighter. It's got very good mimetism, okay ballistic skill, really benefits with an AP Marksman Rifle, benefits a lot from one special die, and benefits a lot from having access to smoke, which the Kriegel agent brings with both a smoke grenade launcher and Fairway Tactics Mirror Ball. Now, you can absolutely link Drow in generic Toha, but they don't have the Triad tag themselves, so to get a bonus on them, you need to have two other Triad troopers. In Spiral Core, if we can duo these with Kriegel, that's potentially really cool, because the Kriegel rounds out the only things that Drow is lacking. The Kriegel adds Zone of Control arrows, with 6 cents, I might add, and visibility control, and a special die, which then lets the Drow do everything else. It's a specialist, it can gunfight once it has that special die. It's a mine layer, it's fast, just a bunch of cool things going on. It's even got decharges for doing stuff like sabotage. So two of those fire teams, that's awesome. We then have a Haris team of a Tagma MSV2. Tagma MSV2 snipers do of course exist in Toha, but with very, very limited access to regular smoke, they're a little bit mid. When you have linked Kriegel with smoke grenades, if those are a thing that exists, becomes quite good again. Kael'thar Chain of Command with two Symbiomates. Spiral Core only have AVA1 Kael'thar. And so Ed is paying the premium to get the two Symbiomate version so that both Drow can have Symbiomates, then a Kumatel Bioengineer to hang out near the Tagma, then two Chaksa FTOs and an Agao. The Agao is the last piece that Ed is experimenting with here. This is the full expensive kit profile, so it's got Mirror Ball, very dangerous close combatant, and it gets to sort of like sit amongst the Drow mine layers because all of the mines the Drow lay will share a combat group, so the Igao is kind of like, okay, there is a Drow with two camouflage markers near it, one of them's going to be something that isn't a mine, but whichever one it is, we can sort of conceal the Igao a little bit that way, just trying something different to what Ed would usually use in this slot, which would have been something like Eclipsos. Overall, I was particularly impressed with some of the stuff that he would do with the Drow and Kriegel, but rather than talking about that now, let's jump into the game. Now, we are playing Supremacy, which means one classified, and I drew Sabotage, which I snapped picked because the other option was the one where you have to get an engineer or something into base contact with an enemy, remote tag, or heavy infantry. And since I was playing against Spiral Core, I didn't expect any of those. So pretty much a snap pick with Sabotage, even though I only had one model that could do it. But more importantly, Willpower 12 versus Willpower 13, I would win the LT roll. And although I had a little bit of agony about this, I was pretty confident overall that I needed to pick Tableside, which then Ed picked to go first. Now, going second against Spiral Core is not a walk in the park. Ed is ruthless with Greif operators. The Drow are forward deployed to do very aggressive attack runs, and it's a faction that has counterintelligence almost 100% of the time. But Spiral Core generally, and Ed very much in specific, is the kind of player who is very like scalpel oriented. The analogy that I made during the game is that Ed is the kind of player that makes one cut to win the duel, where he is extremely like precise with his order expenditure. He knows exactly what he wants to accomplish. He picks the thing, he picks the line of play that is like the winning line of play. He doesn't brawl. And if you are going first in Supremacy, then you kind of need to just punch your opponent a whole bunch just to bring down the amount of points they have on the board so that in later turns they can't contest spaces that you're holding. You can't really win Supremacy with a single kill. Even a lieutenant kill in Supremacy doesn't necessarily put you in a position to win round on round on round, brawling fights over control of these zones. And even when thinking about like Spiral Core in the context of this scenario, if I was to go first, I would need to make those brawling fights. I would need to swing, make the first swing, try and drop a bunch of points out of Ed's list, and Ed is playing Spiral Core, which means he has helots, which will be under camouflage markers, and mines, and ferroware. And so just my general assessment about the matchup is that if I had the option, I was absolutely not willing to deploy first, go second. But if I could deploy second, go second, that was probably the better play, and it would kind of be borne out over the course of this game. So I have won the role. I've picked to deploy second on the right side of the table from this perspective, and Ed locks in going first because basically for the same reasons he doesn't want me to have an attack run that I can engineer after seeing where all of his Drow are deployed, for example. And so from top to bottom, up here we have one of the two Jaxes. It's in position to just move 2 inches and get into a zone. Nice and clever. We then have a Drow and Kriegel fire team in this position. The Drow is up on this like increasingly tiered high ground. It's got 2 camouflage markers near it, one of which will be a Nagao, one of which will be a mine, and then the Kriegel is knocked into this position here. Now, one of the things that can absolutely happen with Drow Kriegel fire teams we found over the course of this game is that the Drow can just outstrip the Kriegel or just get away from them a little bit too easy, but keeping them together did perform well, and this is a nice little defensive position that can also stage itself for an attack. Around this high ground in the center, we have deployed Nemo Shatar, which I knew immediately was a viral sniper because Nemo would never be deployed here. But that's a song and dance we've played many times. The bioengineer is hanging out next to Nima, and then on ground level over here, we have the Kael'thar specialist completing the triad. Everyone prone to begin with, but with the MSV2 sniper able to stand up and take shots if it needs to. Further down, we have a second Drow and Kriegel fire team. The Drow's mine is deployed quite aggressively. The Drow itself is a little bit further back, able to move up into this building. The Kriegel, now this is kind of like deploying on your deployment line like this Chuxa and Kriegel are, is a little bit risky, but we're playing these buildings as infinitely tall, and so they're safe to make one move without being seen. We've then got a Kauri Sentinel deployed back here with the most aggressively anti-Garuda positioned mine on this high ground. This is really sensible. Ed knows that I'm taking a Garuda in the same way that I know he's taking a Greif operator. And the detonation radius of this mine will very cleanly shut down any super jumping shenanigans in a fairly wide area. So that's quite sensible. We've also got 2 helots. One is by this lower building ready to move up and forward and be annoying, and the other is watching more or less centrally. It is watching kind of like backfield and into this wooded midfield area. Just 24-inch range bands on these guys. They're deployed very sensibly to stop penetrations into the DZ, and mostly deployed to guard attacks that might be launched against the Drow. So good sensible deployment. Ed's reserve would be the Greif operator, which we'll get to in a tick. Now, for my part, a quick philosophical note about my deployment. I very strongly suspected that a Greif operator or equivalent was coming as the reserve drop. Now, I had an initial temptation to use all of the auxiliar oxbots to try and like defend in really close against those kind of pieces, but ultimately that wouldn't necessarily accomplish anything, because what I was going to do was have my reserve drop be the mine layer peacemaker. I already absolutely had the possibility to make the Drow going in on any one piece a suicide run for that Drow. And since I was already doing that, there was no reason to also have those Oxbots tighter into my deployment zone, so instead they are more aggressively positioned on picket duty, because I also have to defend against things like Drow making attacks into my DZ, or attacking like up close, etc. So despite the fact that the comfortable thing to do would be to have had each of these Auxilia having an Oxbot defending them really closely, nope, we have left the Auxilia exposed, because if a Drow goes in, sorry, if a Greif goes in on either of the Auxilia, I'm going to just snap deploy in response with a Peacemaker. And so, from top to bottom, we've got an Oxbot and its Auxilia on the, my far right flank. We then have the Orc and Bipandra fire team. There's a Fugazi drone bot just up on the roof up there. But then an Orc and Bipandra fire team kind of in the center right of my deployment zone. The Orc boarding shotgun is positioned furthest forward. Nothing is really on ARO duty here, except the HMG is positioned to have fairly good overwatch to the left and right of Arc into my deployment zone. It doesn't want to have a scrap with Drow coming up over the high ground, but it does want to be able to shoot anything that's moving around inside my DZ, like for example impersonators. We then have a Warcore up on the roof of this truck. She's in cover, got a 360 line of sight. The Bulleteer and the Blade Operator are then also on the low ground, ready to move up and around through the center. The Bolt duo, the Bolt is the only thing I have that sort of is actually on ARO duty. The Bolt Sniper is behind this crate, but it has a line down past this helicopter and then up and over onto the high ground. Both of those would actually be kind of important lines of fire, even though the Bolt wouldn't move too much over the course of the game. especially given the bolt is one of my best pieces against Drow. We then have another Fugazi Dronbot, and then the second Auxilia with its Oxbot are on the far left flank, with the Oxbot watching close attacks in that might be able to run around, flank, and attack my bolt team from close up. Now, in terms of lieutenants, one of the Auxilia is the LT. It's the one on the right flank. The reason for that is that it's protected by an Orc. That's just going to lightly disincentivize an attack on it, gives it a slightly better chance of survival, although ultimately neither Auxilia is a hugely valuable target by itself. Only if Ed knew who the LT was would it be worth going in on a decap strike. In the midfield, behind this high ground, we have the first of my two peacemakers. The Oxbot is up on this first tier of high ground here on my right in order to just have its flamethrower hopefully dissuade Drow and possibly mobile camouflage markers from attacking me, and it is that Peacemaker that draws the attention of the Greif. So the Greif will deploy up on the high ground looking down onto the Peacemaker, and I will respond by putting my Peacemaker, not the Peacemaker itself, it will be safe, but that Peacemaker's Oxbot and it's mine, deployed to pinch the Drow off and make any attack, so to pinch the Greif off and make any attack by the Greif a one-way trip. Ed's got counterintelligence, but I will take an order away from his big combat group in any case. The big combat group, often I might sort of consider taking orders away from the smaller combat group, but in this case it's very clear that the Greif is only ever going to spend one order under ideal circumstances, and nothing else is really going to be attacking me, whereas even one order could make a big difference off of those Drow Kriegel teams. After Speedball, that's going to leave me with only 2 command tokens, which actually probably are kind of important because I do have a doctor and an engineer, and Lord knows the engineer especially needs rerolls, but it did still feel worthwhile. Now, as happens, the first order of the game is the Greif operator peeking out over a ledge onto the Peacemaker, revealing itself, putting the Peacemaker unconscious, and getting absolutely burnt to a crisp by an Oxbot. I'm happy with that as a result. Ultimately, that is kind of a trade up for Ed because that is a 20-point Greif versus a 27-point Peacemaker. But I have a Speedball and an Engineer. I can get that thing back. If I get that thing back, then that's an acceptable casualty. Now, the rest of that combat group, as expected, is just going to be things like Helots repositioning, which means the bulk of the action in the first turn otherwise is on these Drow and Kriegel teams. And it's here that we see one of the really interesting things that Ed has learned to do over the course of N4, which is build forward positions with Tohar fire teams. And this is something that I actually want to incorporate into my own play, because it is hugely annoying to play against, and I cherish that as a style of play. So the line that Ed has identified is that there are doors through these buildings along my left flank that allow a pretty unopposed run up towards, not into my DZ, but just outside it. So the plan is going to be, and it all works relatively flawlessly, that with the orders that they have, this Kriegel and Dral are going to move up through this first building, press the button on the way through, up and into the second building, press the button on the way through, and then take a gunfight from the tip of this building inside 16 inches of the bolt. Now, that's not a perfect face-to-face roll. The bolt has marksmanship, it has an MSV1. Getting inside 16 inches of it means that it's rolling 2 dice on 10s versus the Dral's 4 dice on 12s. That's a favorable fight for the Drow, but the Drow is only packing damage 7 ammunition. The kind of expected thing happens, which is that the Drow wins the face-to-face roll, but not convincingly. One shot gets through, and I pass the save, and the Bolt's just like, nope, we're good, I'm not taking this fight anymore, and it hides. Now, on the way through, it is also able to spend a classified doing something to my HVT. All of that does mean that enough orders have been spent that with one button pressed, another button pressed, and the HVT all interacted with, and one face-to-face roll, Ed's not able to aggressively push up into my DZ, and there's nothing that he can do with the Kriegel in terms of Ferroware, because the only things the Kriegel is facing down are bolts, and they are warhorses, so they can't be erased. What he can do with the remaining orders is just build a really annoying position aggressively close to my DZ. And so as we flick into my first turn, what we'll see is that this building has been turned into a strong point. We have a duoed Dral and Kriegel agent. The Kriegel agent has Sixth Sense and Mirror Ball and Eraser, so engaging into it can be quite difficult. Even though I have a lot of pieces that can kind of deal with it. Oh, the war correspondent is unconscious, by the way, news at 11. Even though I have a lot of pieces that can kind of handle the Eraser Ferroware, I've got attack remotes, I've got Tinbot models, etc. The fact remains that most of my stuff, all of my stuff, is gunfighting. And if I approach incautiously, and even with a model with stealth, that Kriegel agent can just piss out a whole bunch of smoke in zone of control and effectively render these models kind of invulnerable. So I have to be very careful in my approach, and because the Drall has mines, it's just laid some mines as part of this approach. So there is a mine that is covering not quite entry into the building, but anything that moves around to attack the Drall is just going to cop a shock mine in the face for its trouble. There is a window I could kind of like peek my nose in through, but same deal. It would detonate the mine, these models would get AROs. And this is the kind of thing that Ed's gotten really good at, because he just builds these like fire bases. The first time I saw him do it really convincingly was with generic Toha, where he and I were playing Armory. And I have kind of like a standing tactic in Armory that served me very well, which is if I'm going first, I just don't open the gates. I make that my opponent's problem, and I set up to kill anything that they put into the objective room, which then just puts me in a good position for the entire rest of the game. And I went ahead and let Ed open the gates, and then he dumped so much stuff and so many mines and so much ferroware that I just couldn't dislodge them without breaking my wrists in the process. And so we had this really difficult back and forth game off the back of the fact that you have these Toha teams that have got ferroware as an ARO and lots of multi-wound pieces and a symbiomate and just random dudes with mines that just build these little defensive pockets. And it was a tactic that I've never used, that kind of a tactic in N4 where I played Toha a ton, because the pieces that enable it, particularly the models with mines, either didn't exist or weren't things that I could take or weren't things that I would take, because they were things like the engineer, the Coswheel. Now, the Coswheel, however you pronounce that, has kind of eclipsed some of the other things in its points bracket as a like good link filler option. And it took Ed discovering that and doing all of this like layering the ferroware and even just having a Libertos be like, I'm spending 2 orders laying mines. All of this stuff is kind of really cool. And so as I begin my first turn, I am staring down the barrel of the fact that that is 62 points in one of my forward zones, not where I have my peacemakers, and I'm gonna have to dislodge them somehow. So we better get about doing that, and it's not going to be easy. Now, fortunately, we haven't really sustained that many casualties. We've lost a peacemaker and the war correspondent, and that's it. All of our tactical awareness pieces are still intact. The first thing that we do, however, is just go ahead and try and land the Garuda. Its fizz isn't good, but if it lands in my deployment zone, I actually have uses for that. It's totally fine. And parachuting it on is just kind of not going to be an option. Ed has locked down the deployment zone lines really comfortably. In his, like on this side of the table, along the top of the table from this point of view, there's a Taxa Flamethrower, which will just burn a Garuda to a crisp. There's a Helot on the bottom side of the table. So in order for me to approach, I kind of have to be in the middle, and since that's the case, we'll just try and land it. And it rolls, I think, a 5, needing an 11, and it lands. In response to this, Nemo is revealed to the shock of nobody to be a viral sniper and stands up, and I just fight her with the Garuda. In fact, I do a bunch of fucking around trying to see if I can fight her with other things, and Orc takes a face-to-face roll at bad range as part of movement up the field. It's all kind of naff, and then the Garuda just goes, I'll just do this myself, and puts the Tagma unconscious. That's important because once the Tagma is down, the Garuda is able to make a very complicated move where it moves from the ground level up and around and then back down, specifically in a way where it is always keeping this bridge and this tree between itself and the Drall and camouflage markers up here, because I know one of these camouflage markers is real. That allows me to get line of sight to this Chaxa from outside of 10 inches, gun it down like a dog, and then that's it. The Garuda's part in the game is done for now because it's 25 points in this quadrant, which is now only being contested by a Helot. So cool. I have almost certainly signed the Garuda's death warrant, but I've got that zone, which means now I just need to secure the other zones against the pieces that are in them. I've already got my top right zone, or my right zone, because the Greif died on the way in, which means we just need to deal with the Fort Kickass that Ed has built. And so we're going to go about doing that with our Orc fire team. They're going to move up and around through this space here. As I mentioned, there's going to be some faff back and forth fighting with the Tagma Sniper that will be inconclusive, doesn't really matter. We will drop down a pair of speedballs. I'm looking for an auto repair kit, which I get in order to recover on the way through, because Orcs are 6-2, right, nice and fast. On the way through, we're going to speedball and recover the downed Peacemaker, excellent, and then carry on through to assault this position that Ed has built here. Now we have to be very careful with this as a run, specifically with our angle of approach, where we cannot come within 8 inches of the Drall, not the Drall, of the Kriegel, before it's face-to-face roll time. Because if we come into 8 inches of the Kriegel, it will zone of control smoke us out with 2 dice. and that's the entire attack run done. But we are able to do that by approaching from this direction. There are some dodges, there's some back and forth, a bolt takes a gunfight at some point, doesn't really do anything, and ultimately, after a bunch of work, the breach is stormed, an attack run is launched on this position, and after all of the orders I have remaining in that group, I put the Kriegel down, and I knock a wound off of the Drall, and that's it. Now I do end up with Bipandra in kind of a safe space, and with both orcs, one of them wounded, the shotgun is wounded, looking at the Drall. But between having to split burst, and the mimetism, and the symbiomate, and the limited number of orders I have in the pool after the Garuda has done all of its stuff, that's just all that I can accomplish. Now, it is enough, right? It's enough to have models in this zone that outweigh the Drall, even though it's 40 points. 2 orcs and Bipandra is comfortably enough to overwhelm the points that Ed has in that zone. But it's just kind of testament that this 3-person fire team, comprising Ballistic Skill 14 heavy infantry, with a tactical awareness order, and most of an order pool to spend, couldn't actually put that attack team that Ed had postured there down and out. That's just really interesting and also kind of not surprising. Attacking those things, unless you have exactly the right tools, is a huge tick. So, really cool test on Ed's part. Ultimately, I would be able to win the Drall, kill the Kriegel, and get enough points in zones, but it's just kind of a fascinating showcase of how that concept of Drall and Kriegel as not just an attack team, but a dig in and hold team kind of works. Now, the remainder of my orders, I think I had one order that got spent on the Bolt. The remainder of the orders are spent on the Peacemaker in Group 2, the Mine Layer one, which jumps and moves up and around and will ultimately occupy this high ground here. Now, I had plans for an attack on the Drall, but Ed is savvy to those. The idea was that I could get the Oxbot around and see all the camouflage markers, including the one that had moved, and the Drall, and just declare a template attack that would hit everything, and the Drall has to dodge, or else lose its symbiomate, and of course the whatever it is under the camouflage marker, at that point I knew it could have been either a Beastmaker or a Beast Hunter or an Agao, would have to dodge as well. Just a really high value attack. Ultimately, the Drall dodged as I was making the attack run, got into a better position, and so I content myself by just laying some mines and setting back and just like locking the position down in the same way that he was doing to me on my left flank. Overall, even though I have pressed no buttons and not accomplished my classified, this is still a pretty good turn. As we look at the beginning of Ed's second turn, I am setting up the preconditions for my eventual victory, which is that I'm clocking up those actual points every round on round for scoring more zones, and I'm just a little bit ahead in terms of attrition. As we mentioned at the beginning, if you're going first in Supremacy, much of the time what you have to do is really brawl with your opponent to wear down their forces so they can't contest zones, and that's not how Ed's Toha or Ed generally kind of are built to play. And so I am forcing that situation where I'm reconstituting my troops, I'm killing Ed's troops, and I'm building that force advantage, which is what you need to do going first to win at all, but if you can do that going second in Supremacy, it will usually put you in a really excellent position. I'm also following one of my cardinal rules when it comes to playing against Ed's Spiral Core, which is to just not fight the Helots. This is a very good rule, and I stand by it. Many people have failed to follow this rule and lost games accordingly, so in that respect, I offer my limited wisdom. Now, Ed is beginning his second turn. He'll spend a command token, consolidate order pools a little bit, but he's now facing down a lot of elements that he kind of has to attack into, which are going to cost him to attack into, particularly with both of the Peacemakers now back and active, and another mine placed in this location. It's just not an easy run up through this position, and he really has to deal with that Garuda. This is the turn when the Agao is finally going to get a chance to strut its stuff. The Agao is this camouflage marker over here by this objective, and it's going to come down here. Now the Garuda will start preemptively dodging, mostly in the hope of luring out of camouflage. It's Fizz 11 and it will fail all of its dodges, and eventually the Agao will get into close combat and execute it roughly. The Garuda will respond with its Para CCW, but the Agao is just grossly better than it is in close combat. It's like Martial Arts 3, CC 23, it natively has CC attack -3, which means from surprise it's imposing a -9, and it just blats the Garuda, walks away, executes the Garuda on the way out, not because Ed needs to do a classified or anything, but because Ed is aware that I have an engineer hanging out back here with Gizmo Kit, and then with the remainder of the orders in this group, the Agao will come up and around, lay down some smoke covering entry into this room, and then get into close combat with the Orc. The Orc is wounded, the Agao will comfortably win the face-to-face roll again, and put the Orc unconscious, but not dead. Now, in basically all respects, that's a good, clean turn. It's also the best performance either of us have ever seen from an Agao, putting down like more than 50 points worth of miniatures in a turn. But ultimately, it's one of those situations where it's kind of just not quite enough, because to overcome the second player advantage in Supremacy, you have to swing with a hammer, not with a scalpel. Now, my resources going into my second turn are diminished. This Orc team, for example, has the Orc down, the Fire team is broken. I don't really want to activate any of these pieces, but we've got plenty of other stuff to attack with. And so we're going to do a multi-pronged attack on this position. We're going to start with the Peacemaker in Group 2 and its Oxbot. They're going to jump again. 8-inch jumps are really far. Got to get down onto this low ground and then come around and attack into the building. Because of where the Agao is, I'm actually able to lean the Peacemaker out over the top of this building to stare down into the door, while the Oxbot makes an attack round from here. The Oxbot is able to use the length of its template to actually see the Agao from outside of nanopulsar range, which is really useful because it means the Agao can't respond with a template, potentially killing my Orc. And although the Agao survives, the dodge that it makes has to carry it into a position where it's up against this window, at which point the Bolt is able to come around and put it down cleanly. Now, the Agao has triggered Frenzy, the Bolt has Marksmanship, bit of a wash there, but 3 dice hitting on 10s. Sorry, not 10s, 3 dice hitting on 13s, even with a very, very good dodge because the Agao has that stupid bang bomb rule. 3 dice hitting on 13s does it, double action round, puts the Agao dead. Now the Drall is still there, but at this point I can safely move by Pandra up and around. She recovers the Orc, I reform this Fire team, and the Orc is able to take a really good face-to-face roll now because it's just the Drall. The Drall does not have its Mimetism anymore, and 4 dice on 20s is really good as it turns out. That puts the Drall down, and this is where we can see that like turning of the tide, because Ed is having to push into my side of the board, but he's not able to really deliver knockout punches with a Spiral Core style force. I'm able to clean those pieces off at great difficulty, but we are ultimately getting up on that attrition, and we're going to continue on by having the Orc HMG move around to this window and then back and make a Discover roll against this Helot. Now, I don't actually expect to succeed. I'm mostly doing this to posture the Orc boarding shotgun, but then I succeeded the Discover roll, and I'm not actually sure what to do with that. The plan was that I would then spend another order and have the Orc boarding shotgun run up and around here toward the Helot. The hope was that Ed would do nothing, waiting for me to discover, then I would do nothing and get the Orc into that zone, which would score me 2 points again. But with the Helot having been revealed, I actually feel kind of obligated to deal with it now because it will always attack my Orc, and running an Orc into the open against a Helot with a submachine gun and light rocket launcher, I'm a bit unconvinced by. So we bring up the Bulleteer, and this is where it finally proves its quality. It's repositioned to previous turn with a tack-aware order, it gets another tack-aware order from the Blade, it's going to come up and around here, up and around the helicopter and close in at short range, and it turns out that 3 dice on 15s versus 3 dice on 5s is also a really good face-to-face roll. The Bulleteer puts the Helot down cleanly while it's in the ballpark. It's able to move around and get into this zone as well. And I've even got some orders spare to press a single button. We get this button down on my left zone scored, and we just have tons of stuff in this location. And it's not the game is over, but the game is very close to resolved at that point, because this is the second round in a row where I have secured enough zones to get the 2 scenario points. And even if Ed is able to just like roll perfectly on his final turn, there are just kind of too many things now. Ed maths this out, he kind of figures out where he can score points. It is possible for him to actually get a draw, but it would require a series of miracles. More reasonably, he might be able to get to 5, and so his turn is predicated on that. He abandons his right flank. All of this zone around these 2 buildings is basically given up. That's not something that can be dealt with right now. Instead, this Drow goes on an attack run, this Drow on the high ground, and basically starts trying to gun down peacemakers. There's a bunch of back and forth. It does put this one over here down, but that's all it's able to accomplish before it's forced back. There is a bolt on our row that it's trying to have to like hide behind bridges and stuff to deal with, and once it finishes its run, it is at the end of Ed's turn in a position to dominate this zone, but all I'm able to do, I just have to move the Auxilia up and around, and that's enough points to outweigh it. The 27-point +1 burst Peacemaker, which has spent the entire game just being either unconscious and then revived or otherwise doing nothing. I had high hopes for it, but not every game can include every model that you want doing things. It's 27 and the Auxilia is 14, which is more than the Drall's 40. And then every remaining order that I have is just spent pressing this button. Ultimately, I'm able to do that. That puts me on 9 of the available 10 points versus 4 for Ed, and wraps up the game. Now, ultimately, a lot of this was very heavily predicated on I won the lieutenant role. We both know this matchup well. It hasn't changed too egregiously, as it turns out, between editions. Both of us are familiar with what we have to defend against to succeed. If Ed had won the role and picked deployment, I would have been in a very unfortunate position where if I wanted to go second, I was going to have to give him a series of perfect attack runs. I wasn't willing to do that. He wasn't willing to do the same, where his Drall would be in position to be counterattacked very comfortably by me on my first turn. And so from that point onwards, we both kind of like played the hands that we were dealt. Dice could have swung it at any point, particularly the pivotal attacks on this area, but once I was able to get in position, recover certain pieces, once I was able to, even after like the first turn, mostly crack this position, the resources that Ed had in place to respond ultimately involved just slightly too many trades, and that got Neoterra the win in this game of Supremacy. And that's probably a good point to segue just kind of briefly into some thoughts about Corvus Belli bringing back these sectorals, because I have genuinely kind of mixed opinions on them. I have the opinion of Rob the gamer who's played Infinity for a long time and likes content and has an affection for these factions. And then I have opinion of Rob the person who does kind of know a little bit about how business works and how game design works and how you design for a market. And those aren't quite in accordance. From the perspective of someone whose first faction ever was Neoterra, and who now loves the shit out of Garudas, and who had an affection for Caledonian Highlander Army, like all of these, I'm personally pleased to see them back. They're cool. I have an affection for them. I loved these sectorals. I'm also a person who really gets into games, and so I voraciously devour content. I want more stuff to chew on, to build lists for. I am a person for whom a game can expand in scope almost indefinitely, and I will continue to consume that. But that's where we butt up against kind of my intellectual opinion about how game design mostly has to work, which is that games can't, for most players, expand indefinitely in scope. There are kind of two issues with a game expanding forever. The first is just the new player experience. Once a game gets too large, the only way to be able to learn it is to know a huge amount of it all already, so you only have to internalize and contextualize the new information each time it's released. If Infinity adds 5 more and then 10 more and then 20 more, whatever, sectorals, that becomes an increasingly taller mountain for a new player to scale. And it also becomes like less and less possible for a store, even an online store, to stock because as the range expands. Now, Corvus Belli have kind of solved that second problem by having phased production, where different miniatures and different sectorals, we have the in production, out of production approach, etc. But even that has flaws when thinking about how new players might onboard to the game, because a player can go, oh, cool, there's a Scottish faction, I can't buy it. Oh, okay, cool. Well, I'll give this a miss until it's back or something, right? And so, for these kind of valid reasons, you need to keep the game within, like, a game can be large, a game can have a lot to digest and a lot to work through, but ultimately there is a kind of maximum size that you want from an ideal design perspective. And Infinity was really, really big at the end of N4. It was just a large game in terms of the stuff that occupied the space. And so Corvus Belli made the difficult decision, and they did the hard work to cut down on the scope of the game. So it was more approachable, so it was more digestible, so that the bulk of the range actually could be purchased if you were so inclined. Relatively few armies existed at the launch of N5 that a new player onboarding to the game couldn't, if they wanted to, actually buy. And they paid the price for this, right? The price was negative will. It was bad will. It was negative opinion from established players. Kind of reasonably, right? I had this game today against Ed. Ed's two factions that he mained in N4 were Varuna and Spiral Core. Both of those disappeared in the Azician transition. Got a very good friend who plays Pan-Oceania who owned literally the entirety of Pan-Oceania, and so half of their collection was effectively invalidated with the edition change. Now, those two players had very different opinions on that change. Ed has played other games, he's been through this before, he's very aware of the fact that ultimately games can't expand indefinitely. And so he kind of made peace with the fact that he would have to find a new way to play Infinity in N5. But the overall point was there was an opinion, a cost in terms of public opinion with downsizing the game. That had to be paid in order to downsize the game, and the game kind of had to be downsized in order to bring it back to a point where a new player could more easily approach it. But Corvus Belli, they did that. They wore that cost, they made that change, And now, about a year later, they're kind of walking it back. And so I'm sitting in a position where Rob, the player, is super happy to have more content and more armies to play and more things to look at and to see some old favorites return. But most people don't play games with the intensity that I do, right? With the mental focus. I am lucky enough to not have kids. I have a reasonable-ish work-life balance as far as one can in 2025. I have a supportive relationship that lets me put a lot of mental time into these hobbies that I enjoy, whereas someone who's a dad or a new player or coming back into the game isn't in that position. And I really like having all of this new stuff, but I'm just not 100% sure about it from a broader community and business perspective. Still, at least in the short term, I have not seen anyone express anything that is a negative opinion other than that same kind of concern. The only things I've seen about this, as far as takes go, apart from is this the right business call, have been, woohoo, my army is back. So maybe the goodwill is worthwhile, but that kind of raises the question as to why they would have cut these sectorals in the first place. So it's an interesting thing to have to think about. If you have a take on this, very interested to hear it in the comments. Are you someone who has one of these returning armies in your collection that is keen to play them? Do you have maybe you're keen to get into them in some capacity when they're re-released? What do you think they'll do kind of commercially in terms of model availabilities, for example? Is there something that I am missing from a business development manufacturing context that maybe would make sense of some of these decisions? Very interested in people's takes, even if that take is just, I'm super happy that Acontecimento is back, because that's ultimately, as a player, a very reasonable opinion to have. I certainly really enjoyed this game. It was fascinating to me, like, as soon as we were just rolling for Lieutenant, it's like, I remember all of this. I remember Neoterra, I remember Spiral Core, I remember what I have to watch out for. It was like putting on a comfortable old pair of shoes that I hadn't worn in 9 months, which was a very cool feeling. So here and now in this game, super good time. Very grateful for Ed for the game. Absolutely love just slapping a whole bunch of Oxbots on the board. This is the first time I've had a chance to really use Peacemakers, and they were very valuable, and I'm glad to have them back as well. I mean, they haven't gone anywhere, but they kind of got edged out of a lot of Panashanian lists, mostly because Jackals exist, and frankly are bullshit. But the attack qualities of the Peacemaker were on full display here. Got to see some really cool tactics from Ed, just a really good game overall, and so, even though there are some interesting opinions to be had about the return of these armies generally, cracking game to have actually played. With that, we'll wrap this video up. Just as a quick reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. I put out Infinity videos just about every week. Battle reports, faction focuses, opinion pieces, learning experience, etc. Anything that I hope might be valuable and useful to you guys. That means we will be back next week with more Infinity content, and so I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. Have yourselves a good week, and I will see you next time.